Hello, everyone. Don't forget to say in your chat when you log in where you're coming from, so we can have a nice understanding, a spread of where people are from. Today, first of all, I'm very grateful to you for joining from so many different places. This commitment to this book club is just so moving. I didn't know what to expect when Summer talked about this with me, and it's just wonderful. I Today we're covering chapter 4 in the book, which is I'm looking at chapter 4 in the book, which is Zionism is not colonialism. It's another myth number 4. And our presenter today will be Rahul, and I will pass over to him so that he can start. Rahul, are you ready? Would you like to start?
Yeah, ready whenever everybody else is. So hi everyone, my name's Rahul. I'm dialing in from Singapore and it is 2:03 a.m. here. The topic
Wow.
obviously today is about colonialism, Zionism and colonialism. And just a little bit about myself, I suppose. I've grown up in a former colony and I got really sort of introduced to the whole concept of settler colonialism and what it does to Indigenous people when I lived in Canada for about 16 years. So that sort of gradually built my interest in the topic. And in terms of just sort of drawing the parallels with Israel, Palestine, South Africa, and other places as well, I'd say I've been reading about it for at least about 10 to 12 years. So happy to take up this chapter. And in the interest of having as much discussion as possible, I will get the show on the road. So I've got a little slide deck here. Hope everyone can see it. I'll just make it full screen. Zionism is not colonialism. So as I was sort of putting this deck together and thinking about it, right, I guess what really struck me was how it sort of is a very seamless continuation from the first 3 chapters that we've gone through, right? So, if we kind of think of it as a culmination of those 3 myths that we've already been through, where Palestine was empty, which sort of implies that there was nobody to displace. Jews needed a land. They were persecuted people in need of refuge. So a very natural, reasonable sounding sort of a need, if you want to call it that. And then Zionism is Judaism in the sense of God promising Palestine to the Jews, and how that sort of elicits the natural conclusion that Zionism cannot be colonialism because they're simply a people taking refuge in a land that was always promised to them, right? And it sounds very reasonable. It sounds very rational, almost in a sense, right? Natural, if that. And Professor Pappé, obviously, in this chapter kind of goes around to dispel that myth, right? So in terms of getting through concepts, right? I suppose a key concept in this chapter that he talks about is that differentiation between settler and classical colonialism, right? We're almost, especially in this day and age, when we look at colonialism, we typically tend to gravitate towards classical colonialism simply because there were many more colonies. Much more of the world was in a classical colonial situation as opposed to a settler colonial situation, right? And that settler colonies typically try to shed that label off of themselves, right? If you look at that third point of homeland, right, they try to emphasize on that concept of homeland as opposed to colony, right? So just a quick sort of comparison, obviously, there's imperial support in the establishment phase when it comes to settler colonies. And the distinction sort of being that they covet both the land and the resources of the colony for the settler, as opposed to only the resources in the colonies, right? And the evolution into a national homeland versus sort of staying in servitude towards the imperial power throughout. So the concept, obviously, that distinction is important because in one of those cases, in sort of extractive colonialism, there's really taking the resources and subjugating to the point that you're able to get what you want. But in areas that weren't as important to the colonial powers, you typically see them being sort of left alone for the most part, right? Whereas in settler colonies, there is a logic of elimination, and ultimately that is sort of underneath it lies a logic of dehumanization, because that elimination doesn't happen unless you can dehumanize the people that you need to get rid of, right? And so that's why I think Professor Pappé refers to them as twin logics, because they both sort of interact, or there is a sort of the logic of dehumanization is ultimately a prerequisite for genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, or any other form of subjugation that you're going to put into place to keep the indigenous people, quote unquote, in check, right? So as we had sort of the first and second Aliyah, right, in the late 18th late 19th and early 20th century, what you note is, Palestinians by and large did not object to the idea of providing refuge to impoverished and persecuted Jews coming in from Europe or seeking refuge from Europe, right? And again, if you kind of go back to the broader history as well, right? I mean, you've had large waves of Jewish immigration into North Africa, for example, during the Spanish Inquisition, right, towards the 1490s, as Ferdinand was sort of taking over the Iberian Peninsula. Jews were getting pushed and pushed and pushed out, and many of them did take refuge in Morocco and Algeria, or what became today Morocco and Algeria. And in this sort of case too, right, you did see early evidence of coexistence and cooperation, especially in urban centers where they had to trade and they had to do business together and things like that. And often it was at the dismay of early Zionist leaders who were trying to convey the idea that this was an empty land, right? So, and you sort of really only see opposition to settlement come when the colonialist ambition becomes evident, or it becomes sort of explicit, right? And that comes with really the Balfour Declaration in 1917, right? So the wordage specifically used is very clear, right? The establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, right? And what's very telling about the marginalization of the Palestinians is that they're simply referred to as the non-Jewish population, and they are simply referred to as having civil and religious rights, as opposed to having any national or political rights, right? So that sort of idea of politically marginalizing them becomes apparent. And I thought I would just quickly pull this up, right, in terms of a couple of examples, right? But the mandate, if you actually kind of go through the articles, they put forth various provisions, I suppose, right, to help the Zionists run a parallel administration with the British, right? So in this, you saw things like, for example, nationality. Right, you already start to see nationality laws evolving, where Palestinian citizenship was only given to Jewish immigrations, and those, let's say, Palestinians or Arabs who went abroad for a while and wanted to come back were having a hard time to get back into the country. Quasi sort of governmental agencies or parallel government agencies were run by the Zionists with regards to local administration, with regards to being able to lobby for their cause overseas, and representing themselves formally in international circles and so on, right? Rashid Khalidi's good book, actually, The 100 Years' War, does a really sort of detailed breakdown on it if anyone wants to have a bit more of a read. And so during the mandate, obviously, as this comes up, you start to see resistance, right? Very much like how, as settler colonialism became more apparent in the US, you started to see various tribes in the United States as well sort of push back and resist against colonization, right? Or the displacement, really, right? So broadly speaking, you had sort of two ideas which we went through in some of the earlier chapters of Qawmiya and Wataniya, right? Qawmiya sort of being a pan-Arab sentiment, and nationalism being something that's a little more localized or concentrated towards Palestine itself. But regardless of whether somebody subscribed to Qawmiya or whether they subscribe to Wataniya, at the end of the day, if you vis-a-vis Balfour, they objected to being part of a Jewish state. For them, they said, we're happy to share the land with whoever has already migrated, but ending migration at the expense of ourselves is not something that we're going to, um, uh, that's something we're going to object, essentially, right? And, the political, and ultimately, because the Balfour Declaration and the mandate itself was sort of the preclude for creating a Jewish state, right? That came at the expense of the Palestinians in the sense that they were politically marginalized. And so you did gradually see more violent forms of resistance take place because there was simply there was no space for any political expression um, to have their rights given any sort of importance, right? So you saw you did see flare-ups in 1929, 1936, right? Sort of being two flashpoints, if that. And I mean, there's other things that Professor Pappé goes to with regards to some of the personalities and so on, right? But I think in terms of driving home the point that Zionism is settler colonialism, right? Ultimately, I think if I were to sum it up in 3 points, I would really say that, okay, there was always an intent to create an exclusively Jewish state in historical Palestine. Migrants came and they
Hey,
sort of
hey,
sorry.
it's just, oh,
So migrants arrived from across Europe fleeing persecution while claiming an exclusive God-given right. So again, this is a right to us and to nobody else, right? And so an exclusivist project of settling the land or having people come from elsewhere to come and build this state, by definition, necessitates removal, right? And therefore necessitates dehumanization because that removal can only be done through violence, right? Um, it's not something you can persuade. You can't persuade somebody to just leave their home if they've been there for millennia, for generations and generations and generations, right? So I think it's, in my opinion, at least, I think it's a pretty clear-cut case as far as Zionism being settler colonialism is concerned. And just a point of note, I suppose, right? In the Second World War, right? I think Israel has been looking to shed that colonialist label quite actively. So if you kind of go back to the late 19th and the earlier 20th century again, right? You would see that a lot of Zionist language and symbolism was actually overtly colonial in the sense, you, for example, had the Jewish Colonial Trust, and I think, if I'm not wrong, the JNF was called something else as well before it changed its name again, right? But for example, the organizations that were going and buying land, I think they were called the Colonial Trust or the Colonial Land Trust or something like that, right? But in the sense that they you would see them use the language of we are coming and we are civilizing the people here, we are bringing modernity and progress and so on. So when they were articulating it in the 19th or the late 19th or the earlier 20th century, you saw them use pretty overtly colonialist language and symbology in relation to the project. But obviously, as times moved on, as decolonization became a more pervasive political phenomenon, right? You can say from the 30s onwards, you could see the movement sort of try to rebrand itself as a national liberation movement, particularly in the 40s onwards, right? And I think the disassociation with colonialism is fundamental because that helps them or enables them to reject framing Palestinian resistance as an anti-imperial struggle, right? Then it becomes very easy to label it as anti-Semitism or terrorism or whatever, right? You can sort of decontextualize it really, right? And to sort of, I suppose, just give you a flavor of what used to be said, I found a few very interesting quotes that I've come across over the years, which I think really sort of drives the point home, right? About displacement, why is there resistance? It is a colonial project, right? This one's really telling, right? This is Ben Gurion in, I think, 1948 or 49, where he says that if I were an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel, that is natural. We have taken that country. We come from Israel, but that was 2,000 years ago. And what is that to them? There was anti-Semitism, Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but that wasn't their fault. They only see one thing, that we've come here and stolen their country. And why should they accept that? Right? So it's almost a very candid admission, right? In that sense. Jabotinsky as well, right? We'd say, I think Netanyahu calls him his forefather, his ideological father, or something along those lines. Colonization is self-explanatory, and what it implies is fully understood by every sensible Arab and Jew. There can only be one purpose in colonization. For the country's Arabs, that purpose is essentially unacceptable. This is a natural reaction, and nothing will change it, right? And just to top it off with Balfour as well, right? Again, that attitude that the Palestinians do not matter, right? In Palestine, we, the British, do not propose to even go through a form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions and present needs and future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs that inhabit that ancient land, right? So you're seeing statements made in, I think this was made right after the Balfour Declaration, when it became sort of clear that there was some opposition mounting by the 1919 or 1920 or thereabouts, right? So yeah, I think all said and done, pretty clear-cut case. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. This was an incredibly good and to the point summary of this chapter. I have 3 quick points and 1 comment. I put in the Ilan Pappé in this chapter refers to Patrick Wolf's term that you mentioned, the logic of elimination. And this is, if you want to read Patrick Wolf's original paper, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, I've shared it in the chat, and the link is there. The paper is available. It's available freely. You don't have to pay or anything or have any special access. It's open access. I'd like to mention really quickly, I don't know if anybody has noticed it over the years, but Israel is always falsely claiming that if it's attacking Gaza or the West Bank or is doing something, it's because it's retaliating against something that's done against Israel. If you read the chapter, you would realize that this false argument, they started it, we're just reacting, is not something that started yesterday. It goes right back to the beginning of the Zionist colonization of Palestine. It's very clear in the chapter, and I wanted to mention that. Another thing too is, you mentioned that as well, is that Palestinians were always prepared to share a state with Jews. They never had a problem with that. But the Zionists were never going to do that. Ilan says shared representation stood against everything Zionism was supposed to be, and I would like to just repeat that Zionism is a project to create an exclusively Jewish state for Jews only and run by Jews only. So there is no at all, ever, never was an idea of sharing anything. When we were taught about and another thing too is the riots of 1929 that Ilan mentions, which, having grown up in Israel, it's actually really important, because when we were taught about those riots, they were always framed as anti-Semitic pogroms, in the same way that the pogroms in Eastern Europe were going on against the Jews. There was never any mention that more Palestinians died in these riots than actually Jews. It was us and nobody else, us being Jews. One last point I wanted to mention is that the Palestinians actually were forced into organizing themselves. They had no choice. In response to facing the threat of their country being taken away from them and being and themselves being removed and replaced, they had no choice but to become organized, and that also included resistance in many forms. It's not just armed resistance. So that's me. That's all I wanted to add. Rahul, feel free to add more if you want, but I'd like to open the discussion.
The only thing I just wanted to say to that, Abigail, is that I think armed resistance, if you typically look at the history in most places in the world, it arises when political options are exhausted. They're extinguished on their sidelines, right? When you leave people with no choice, you don't give them a seat at the table to articulate and air their perspectives and to...
But then in the settler colonial mentality, the armed resistance is then framed
as terrorism.
As terrorism, and it helps in the campaign of dehumanization and demonization of the natives as well, of the indigenous. I want to say something to you and to everybody else about this. We're not reading this book in order so that we can convince others. We're reading this book so that we can feel strong, or any book, and we're educating ourselves, and so that we can feel confident in what we're doing. Has anybody ever wondered why we need to be courageous to stand up for something pretty obvious? If a crime is committed, why do you need courage to stand up for the victim? And anybody ever stopped? I've been called courageous for God knows how long, and I've always thought, why? I mean, isn't it what we're supposed to do? So again, I want to impress on everybody again that we are studying this to give ourselves a sense of confidence that we are grounded in truth. Because to be good activists, we really need to be grounded in knowledge, but not for convincing others. Because if somebody's committing a crime and somebody else is supporting them, what do you think they're going to do? Tell you, oh, yes, you're right, I'm a bad person? They're never going to admit that. That's why the focus, Margaret and everybody, please, I'm encouraging you to focus on the crime. It doesn't matter that the people who live in Israel, in Zionist settler colonial Israel, are calling themselves Jewish. They can call themselves whatever they like. I don't care. They are committing a crime. There is no way that what Israel has done and what Zionism has been doing, and Israel's been doing in the name of Zionism, has ever been okay. And this is what this chapter is talking about. It's never been okay. There's no way that that's ever okay, right? And what we're standing for or against is a crime. So, Margaret, I encourage you. I want to say something that might be a bit uncomfortable in some cultures that are represented here, especially on these aisles that we're part of, that I'm a part of now, is we can't be nice about it. There is nothing to apologize about offending people. If there is a rapist and there's somebody justifying the rapist, do we worry about the rapist's feelings or the feelings of the person who justifies or supports them? We don't. We say, look, mate, what you've done is wrong, and there's no the wanting to be nice is it's part of the problem, actually. One of the things I say to my clients when they come to therapy is, you start therapy being nice. By the time you finish, you're not going to be nice anymore. You're going to be telling the truth, and you're going to have confidence to quietly and respectfully stand up for what's right in your life and politically and in every way. So, Margaret, welcome to our circles. Welcome to this book club. I'm really pleased the book is helpful to learn, and I am sorry about what you encounter, but focus on the crime. Always ground yourself in the crime. Do not get confused by the narratives. This is what this book is trying to do. It's trying to let us not get confused by all these things that people are saying. They're actually not true even. But it's not even the point. And Ilan mentions that even, I think, a couple of chapters ago, or maybe last chapter. He says, nothing justifies it. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So what? So what? If a parent has been abused as a child, does that make it okay for them to abuse their child or neglect their child? Since when does someone else's bad history justify them committing a crime? And that's what we need to say to people. So we're really sorry about your history. Your history is horrible. It does not give justification for what Israel is doing. It's called settler colonialism. It's illegal, full stop. That's it. No more conversation. We're not reading this to try and convince people, because we won't convince them. The people who want to be convinced will join us by themselves. They come to us. I know, because I've met people like that over the years. They come to me, suddenly I get an email out of the blue from somebody saying, oh, I've been reading your articles, and I used to think this and I used to think that, but over the years I've come to realize other things. So when people are ready to open their mind and to see the truth, they will come into it by themselves. We can't convince them. Don't focus on convincing, focus on standing where you are and on the crime. Rahul, you wanted to say something, your hand's risen.
Just wanted to add one point to what you were saying to Margaret as well. So just a couple of things. One obviously is that, to the whole point of history, right? Yeah, what happened in the Second World War was awful. And obviously the history that preceded that in Europe was awful as well, right? But then does that justify displacing or taking that out on somebody else who had nothing to do with it, right? That's the first point. And the second point is just with regards to fact, right? So if you look at if you look in the academy itself, right? If you look at historians, right? There's really very little dispute amongst serious historians as to these facts, right? Like what you see in this book or other books, right? You'll find a lot of the same facts being sort of stated over and over and again, right? And obviously the interpretation amongst historians does differ a little bit, but the base facts aren't really under controversy in that sense, right? Was there an expulsion of Palestinians? Was there displacement? Is this settler colonialism, right? I mean, those frameworks are widely accepted. It's not in the serious dispute amongst most historians. So if Margaret, for example, if you were to pick up other books as well beyond this one, you would find a lot of the same stuff being said over and over again, right?
And thank you, Rahul. And Margaret, there's one more point that I forgot to say, is that you said something about this fellow who told you that your view is a minority view. Well, the answer to that is this. The answer to that is that no significant change in world history has ever come from the majority or the mainstream. If it was up to the majority or the mainstream, you and I would still not be voting tomorrow. And if you're in the UK, we'd still not be voting, and slavery would still be okay. So all significant changes in humanity, any kind of what we think of as progress, comes from minority of people who were a pain on everybody, who annoyed everybody, who made a lot of noise, who persisted in rallying and protesting and causing trouble until finally change arrived. It's never come from the mainstream. The mainstream is comfortable. Why would I want to change anything? So if it's true, I don't know. I think you're right that it's not a minority group. It's not a minority opinion. I think a lot more, the people of the world are very much behind the Palestinians. But even if it was a minority view, so what? This is how change happens. Remind people they would still not be voting, especially women. 123 years it took for women from the first time John Stuart Mills mentioned that maybe women are smart enough to vote, until we actually got the vote in 1928. 123 years it took. And William Wilberforce worked for 52 years, his entire political career, to get slavery abolished in Britain. And it was never a majority. It was never a majority view. It took a huge amount of struggle to do that. So what? Even if it was a minority group, so what? Yeah, okay. The majority is right. Is majority always right? It doesn't matter whether you avoid keywords or don't avoid keywords. The concept among Zionist Jews is that if you do not absolutely love Israel, you're an anti-Semite. You lost the battle before you even started, and everybody who speaks needs to understand that is the point they're starting from. Anyone else? Last word, or shall we just say goodbye? Do you want to unmute yourself and say goodbye before we go?
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye. Go safely, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Pleasure meeting with you.